Hello, everyone. Thanks for your patience as we just got set up here. Thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Ian Gansler. I'm the Government Relations Associate here with AAPA, the American Association of Port Authorities. I just want to extend a big thank you to the Maritime Administration and all of the hardworking staff there that have done a great job in rolling out this new round of grants and evaluating applications for the Port Infrastructure Development Program and for administrating the Marine Highways Program and every other program over at the Maritime Administration. I'm going to kick it over to Chris Connor, President and CEO of AAPA, to make a quick introduction before we hear from MARAD staff today.
Ian, thank you. And really echoing Ian's comments, thanks to all the folks who are joining the call today, and in particularly to the hardworking staff at MARAD, who, as Ian alluded to, have been great partners to the port industry writ large over a long period of time. And of course, reaching kind of an interesting and historic crescendo here with the funding included in the bipartisan infrastructure law. So I'm happy that we're able to schedule this session today so that ports and MARAD staff can hear each other's perspectives on navigating the NEPA process so that grants can be distributed and projects initiated as quickly as possible to help support the rebuilding and the strengthening of port infrastructure and intermodal connectivity. PIDP, as I think most participants are well aware, will award a record $684 million this year. And America's Marine Highways programs will award another $39 million. This record funding has been sorely needed in the maritime industry for decades. And we at AAPA are looking forward to dozens of new projects to move freight and passengers for America's consumers and businesses. It's so important that industry and government work together to put this funding to the best possible use. I'm looking forward not only to an informative discussion today, but to a productive working relationship for years to come as we translate billions of dollars in funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law into projects at ports that create jobs, create efficiencies, and drive down costs. Today, we'll hear from Chris Gilson, Director of the Office of Environmental Compliance. We'll also be hearing from Timothy Pickering, who administers the American Marine Highways Program, and Peter Simons, who administers the Port Infrastructure Development Program. Before I sign off, I want to do a little shameless promotion here for AAPA and just mention to the gathered audience that in a few weeks' time, AAPA is going to be officially launching something we call the POWERS program, which stands for Port Opportunities with Energy, Resilience, and Sustainability. As environmental protection, energy security, and resilience from extreme weather become more critical with each passing day, we want to ensure that ports are at the center of the policy and economic discussions to modernize our transportation and energy infrastructure. So essentially, the POWERS program will be a space for ports, their supply chain partners, and policymakers to convene and find solutions to the most pressing challenges of the 21st century. We're dedicated to turning these challenges into opportunities to grow American businesses and create a more resilient and secure transportation and energy supply chain. Keep an eye out for this and more. Ian, back over to you.
Thanks, Chris. And I'll turn it over to Chris Gilson and the staff at MARAD to give their presentation. And we will take questions at the end of the presentation.
Sorry about that. I was still on mute. First, I'm going to kick it over to Peter Simons. He's got a few words to say, and then we'll dive into the presentation. But thank you to everyone who's here today.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Chris. And thank you all, as Chris indicated, for joining. A big thanks to AAPA for hosting today's webinar. And a particular thanks to Ian for, I know a lot of behind the scenes efforts to both organize and host this call. I wanted to maybe set today's presentation in context to kind of give you a high level overview of what I call the post-award pre-signed grant agreement process, because completion of MARAD's obligations under the National Environmental Policy Act are an important part of that process. So the grant agreement process involves two parallel tracks. One is completion of agency NEPA action, and the second is completion of a grant agreement. And obviously we'll focus on the first one with Chris's presentation, but I wanted to just provide a little bit of detail on the completion of the grant agreement. So grant agreement is finalized when it's signed by the grantee and the maritime administrator, and both completion of NEPA action and completion of a grant agreement are necessary before a project can move into the construction phase. So let's talk briefly about the grant agreement development process. And for those who have already received a grant from DOT, and it could be build, infra, raise, the old Tiger, the process is really essentially kind of the same. There are, I would say, really within that, two parallel efforts. So one is developing the template grant agreement, including approval by the Office of the Secretary. And our legal team does a great job here. They're the ones who kind of run with that process. And it's important to understand that each year's grant agreement is a little different than the one for the prior year. And grant agreements from one program to another are slightly different. And that's because of the differing statutory requirements that apply, let's say, to the Port Infrastructure Development Program, as opposed to, let's say, a grant that is awarded under infra. And then the second kind of parallel effort, and we don't wait until the template grant agreement is approved, is to develop the project-specific terms of the grant agreement. So here we refer to this as really the scope, schedule, and budget portions of the grant agreement. And our grant managers take the lead on this, working with the awardees representatives and MARAD engineering staff. And that process consists of an introductory meeting, an engineering kickoff meeting, which obviously focuses on the engineering aspects of the project, and then preparation of the initial version of the scope, schedule, and budget, which we take from the grant application process itself. So, or the grant narrative that was submitted as part of the application process. And so during those two introductory meetings, it's important that a grantee identify if things have changed from the grant application, and it, particularly as part of the engineering process, we'll talk about issues that we may have spotted as part of the application that perhaps weren't completely flushed out in the application narratives. So if, for example, you've put together a design for pile driving for a wharf, but there's no geotechnical work that's been done, obviously from an engineering standpoint, that is an issue that presents both a potential budget and a schedule risk. And so we work together to develop that scope, schedule, and budget that then goes into the template grant agreement. That combined with the NEPA review, which Chris's office leads MARAD's efforts on, then results in our ability to get to a signed grant agreement. And essentially, it's the same process for all grants that are administered by MARAD. So if you're awarded a grant under, a RAISE grant or an infra grant or an American Marine Highway grant, we'll follow that same process for developing the grant agreement with the awardee. And at this point, I understand Tim Pickering has joined us. He runs the American Marine Highway program for the Maritime Administration. So I'll turn it over to Tim, and then he'll send it over to Chris.
Yeah. Okay. So I can't really add much to what Peter said. He and there's a good reason for that. Is that we have had a bright line drawn as far as where our process ends. The Marine Highway Program is, since we are working with the applicants, the designated projects to get their applications in, we are have the lead as far as the pre-award activities. So getting the notice of funding out. So I work with the Office of Environment and our legal office to make sure that we have all the right languages in, that we have the right, especially this time around. There was, a lot of the new policies of the administrations and things like that had to be all worked out and put in. And we are doing the reviews right now for the Marine Highway grants. And as soon as we prepare the package to go up through the administrator to the secretary, once the secretary signs off on it, that's where my staff's involvement ends. We still work with the programs as far as making making sure that the services is becoming operational. But as far as anything related to the grant agreements themselves, that's Peter's group that handles that. I guess I didn't really have a script ready for this, so but and since Peter covered most of what I would have had to say anyway, for those who aren't familiar with the program, we have a 3-step process, which and I know the AAPA has been heavily involved with the program because you guys helped to write the Marine Highway module. So I'm sure this is old news to most of you, but we have the designation of the routes, which are largely done. There's a few navigable waters, primarily in coal country, that we have not designated yet, and that's primarily because we can't work with bulk products. And then we designate marine highway projects, which are marine highway services, connecting between those marine points along those marine highway routes. And that makes you eligible, once you have the designation, to apply for our grants. And currently we have 56 designated projects. So that's the totality of our applicant pool. And so unlike the other larger infrastructure programs, we typically get a fraction of the we have a fraction of the money, but we also get a small fraction of the number of applications they get. So we typically, on a typical year, we get 12 to 15 applications, and we'd award about 75% of those. This year, I think it'll be slightly different, given the size of the grant money. We have $39.8 million this year. Our typical year is about 10 to 15 million. So with the added infrastructure money, it attracted a little more interest in the program. So we had some bigger asks this year than normal. So we're targeting a end of September award timeframe. And so with that, I guess I'll pass over to Chris. And like I said, the processes for the Marine Highway grants were covered very well by Peter. So there's really nothing more for me to say about that process. Okay, Chris.
All right, thanks, Tim. Thanks, Peter. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Chris Gilson. I'm the director of the Office of Environmental Compliance. I'm also here today with my colleague, Erin Kendall. And, should you have any questions or, want to have any discussions after we're done with this down the road, please feel free to reach out to either one of us. We're always happy to help. So we prepared a quick slideshow presentation for you today. I'm not going to read through everything. I'm just going to pull out some things that I think are or need to be highlighted. And again, at the end, there'll be an opportunity, I believe, for, questions, and we can try and have, discussions as time allows, and always feel free to reach out to us after the fact. So the first thing, what is NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act? It requires all federal agencies to consider their actions before they implement those actions. And every federal agency has their own procedures under NEPA. And I think that's an important thing to understand. Can you go to the next slide, Erin? just a few things to point out. All of our grant and loan programs are subject to NEPA, and basically how it works is all MARAD actions are subject to NEPA. So, this is, we tried to gear this toward the grants. And I think Peter pointed out earlier that NEPA has to be completed before the grant agreement can be signed and funding can be obligated, which basically means that, construction can't start on the action until the NEPA decision has been finalized. We're putting together some guidance right now. It's almost finalized on what is and is not allowed under NEPA through our processes and procedures for some work that can be done. They include things like desktop surveys and in some cases geotechnical investigations, things like cultural resources surveys that may have limited ground disturbance, that sort of thing. Like I said, we're just about done with that, and as soon as we get it finished, it'll be available for anyone who needs that to kind of see. The process will include having to go through the grant program office to get that approved, but at least you'll know in advance what types of activities could potentially be allowed before NEPA is completed as you're going through, finalizing the grant agreement. Next slide. 3 types of actions under NEPA. Categorical exclusions, those are, mostly the simplest type of activity. EAs are a little bit more involved where there may be some potential impact, and it's a little bit longer document that results in a finding of no significant impact. And EIS is, where you have significant potential impacts that need to be analyzed more in depth. Those are usually much larger documents, take longer to do, and require significant analysis and most likely significant mitigation measures. And that results in a record of decision. Next slide. One of the things that is a misconception about NEPA that are about categorical exclusions or CEs, people think that because you fall under a CADEX that no NEPA analysis is required. There are some agencies that have CADEXs that don't need to be documented. We are not one of those. We document everything. So there is a level of effort in order to get the CE done. It's usually not a significant level of effort, but there are a few things that are required, and we do document them. MARAD's a little bit unique. We try and do CADEXs that are a couple of pages long. If anybody has worked with other agencies, especially within DOT like FRA and highways, their CADEX documents are much longer and much more involved. We try and keep it as simplistic as possible with, minimal documentation, minimal pages, minimal level of effort. But again, it's still something that we need to do. Next slide. So there are some cases where a CADEX is not appropriate. There's a kind of a laundry list here. One of the biggest things, and I think it's on the next slide, is that for MARAD, when we are the lead agency, a CADEX will not work if there is rail or if there are roads within the project. So it comes up a lot of times where we are the designated agency through the grant programs for port projects that include rail and road improvements. And if you're doing that, 9 times out of 10, it's not going to fall under a CE. So you want to make sure that you're prepared to do an environmental assessment. There are situations where we can go through rail or highways. It doesn't always work out. So have it in the back of your mind that if you have some sort of a multimodal project that includes rail or roads, you may be required to do an environmental assessment. Next slide. So section 106 consultation, that's under the NHPA. We still have to do that for every project. At this point, it's not something my office does. It's done under the Federal Preservation Office that works closely with the grants office, but basically a separate activity, but it's part of NEPA in that you need to have the section 106 consultations completed before you can finalize NEPA. And that's a federal agency requirement to talk to SHPO and to talk to the tribes. So those consultations have to be done on our behalf. So in cases where you're trying to get a leg up on getting your NEPA completed and your section 106 completed, for example, there may be a situation where you've done the letter, but you've done it on your own behalf. So that might not satisfy MARAD's requirements. We do try and get with SHPOs to not actually have to reopen that consultation. So just so you know that even if you've already done it, there may be a little bit more to that process. But if you come to the table with a grant and it hasn't been done, that's something that's going to need to be done, even if we're doing a categorical exclusion. Next slide. Same with section 7. It's a little bit different. The process and the type of consultation is a little bit different than what happens under section 106, but it's another thing that still needs to be done. Even if you're doing a categorical exclusion, lots of times these section 7 consultations can be done informally. It only becomes a real significant issue when you have the much larger construction projects that might have more impacts. But I'm just bringing these two things up as an awareness thing, that even if you're doing a CADX, these two things still need to be done, and they do take a little bit level of effort, although 9 times out of 10, it's not going to be a significant effort. Next slide. Just some more misconceptions. NEPA is not a permit, it's a process. If you already got other permits from, state or feds, that doesn't equal NEPA compliance. And even if you're complying with a bunch of other environmental laws, MARAD still has that responsibility that we have to do NEPA. There are some states that have a state NEPA process. And what I'll tell you is that the majority of the time, those documents are not fully compliant with what a federal NEPA document would be. That doesn't mean you need to start over and reinvent the wheel. If you had already done a state NEPA document and then you get a grant and you need to do federal NEPA, we can take what's in that state NEPA document and use that information as the basis and basically, for lack of better terminology, just fill in the gaps to make it compliant with a federal NEPA document. So, one of the things that I like to point out is, when you get awarded a grant, MARAD is part of your team. Our environmental office is part of your team. We're working with you to get this done. We know that, NEPA is one of the least desirable things that people want to have to go through, but it is a requirement. It is a process that we have to comply with. So we try every level of effort to streamline and not reinvent the wheel and use existing data or reports wherever we can. And we will work with you to get to the point of having NEPA completed as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So I just kind of wanted to point that out. Next slide. So, if you've already done NEPA for the core, this is one of my favorite examples. We will try and use that document if we can. We generally tell people it's got to cover the entire project. A lot of cases we'll find that if the Corps has done some sort of NEPA evaluation, it's only going to cover the in-water work. And if you have landside work that's tied to that project, it's not that often that we can separate the two out. So, you may still have to go through some hoops to generate a NEPA document for MARAD, but we have had a lot of situations where, the Corps or another federal agency has done a NEPA document and we have just adopted that, and it, has been very simple and easy. But again, every project is, unique in its own way. So I can't give you, hard and fast that we can always adopt a Corps document. We will ask, that's one of the first things we're going to ask you when you come to the table with even a general question of, I'm thinking of submitting for a grant. Okay, well, have you started your Corps permit? And, do you have that NEPA document? And, if we can use that, we totally will. But it doesn't always work out. And it doesn't just work with the Corps. It could be any federal agency that may have done a NEPA document. It just has to be, within a reasonable time frame. It has to cover the entire project. And, the technical information has to be current. So that's kind of it for that. Can you go to the next slide, please? So we just kind of threw this in average timeframes of completing that we see. Obviously, some take longer, some are move much quicker. It just kind of depends. Like I said before, every project is different, but these are roughly the timelines that we see as average. Next slide. So just a couple of tips. Like I talked mostly about the Corps. We do talk to them before grants are awarded. If, in some regions, the Corps works very closely with the ports, and the ports will tell them that they're applying for grants, and the Corps will reach out to us, and we try and be collaborating in advance as much as we can, who's going to do what. The Corps has their obligation to do NEPA on the permit. We would have an obligation to do NEPA on the grant. So in some cases, that's a little more difficult if the grant hasn't been awarded, because there's no federal nexus for MARAD at that point in time. So we wouldn't be able to expend a lot of effort or energy on it, but we will have conversations with the Corps and kind of pre-plan in an unofficial way. Should this particular port or grantee get the grant, how we're going to move forward. And that's been useful to us to, kind of have that somewhat in place before the grant award happens. Second thing, if you have no in-house environmental capacity, you want to make sure that you're working to retain the services of an environmental consultant before you get to grant award. I mentioned this one because I see it from time to time where people will get awarded a grant, and they're kind of not really aware of the NEPA process, and then they're scrambling around, and it takes them a few months to get an environmental consultant on board. And that kind of delays the process a little bit. And, that it can be beneficial if you've got a consultant who's on board already and ready to go, if you have that capability to do that prior to grant award. And I mentioned previously about the CADX for rail or roads. We are working to update our NEPA procedures that includes rail. We're not there yet, but we're hoping to get there soon. And again, I already talked about pre-award activities. Peter's office and his team can help you, work out some of those, but we're going to have guidance pretty soon from the NEPA perspective as to what would be allowed or not allowed. And I think I said this right at the beginning, you know, you can talk to anyone on our staff in the environmental compliance office, and we'd be willing to, you know, give you some scenarios on what we think the process would be. We won't make a final decision until after grants are awarded as to what the NEPA class of action and where we're going, like if there's anything we can use or adopt, that sort of thing. But we can certainly have a discussion in advance of you even applying for a grant. We're happy to do that. We do that all the time. And the other thing is setting up a site visit, you know, as soon as possible after a grant is awarded, working to have various resource agencies at that site visit if it's needed. And if, you know, the grantee so chooses. I'm actually out visiting a port later today, and all of the resource agencies are going to be there at the site visit. We're going to sit down and sort of have a roundtable discussion. You know, it's a very complex project, and we're going to see what potential issues there may be. So, you know, we've used that tool, working with the ports and the resource agencies right at the get-go to try and figure out what potential environmental risks there may be and how we can get that resolved. And it has worked quite effectively for us. So, you know, that's just kind of one tip. And, you know, you can even expand that, start working, having discussions with your core representative, with your, you know, your SHPO, your Section 7 agencies, and just sort of get a feel for what might be some of their concerns before you go down the road. You know, that has proved helpful as well for many people. Is there another slide, Erin? I can't remember if we're at the end. Oh, okay. So I'm pretty much done with going through my stuff. There's my information on there. We can get you Erin's information. You know, reach out to us at any time, and I will kick it back to Ian for the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Chris. That was a great and informative presentation. I'm sure all of our members here feel the same. We have ample time here for questions and answers, so I'd invite anybody who has a question to just raise your virtual hand there, or type a question into the chat box. Please go ahead, Dina.
Hi, thanks. So if a port is applying for PIDP to rehabilitate a dock and, you know, take out creosote treated pilings and put in, you know, something less toxic, and do, you know, some upgrades and make things a little more efficient. Now that there's no process for being able to go through Section 7 consultation because of the Corps and NOAA's memorandum, they don't have a tool for implementing this now. How do ports get through the permitting process so that they can actually apply for a grant?
That's a very good question. Yeah, that's kind of a new thing, and I'm not real sure how we're going to navigate through that. I mean, you can obviously still apply for a grant. We do get through the Section 7 process, and it varies based on location to location as to how we've been doing that. I'm not sure where you're located, and if I'm familiar with
Pacific Northwest, where we
okay.
can't get through
Yep.
the permitting process.
Yep.
Yeah, at all.
Well, I'll tell you that I've been having a lot of conversations with the various folks in the PNW, and it's my understanding that they may be getting somebody specifically at NIMS to kind of work through some of these issues.
That would be news
I
to me.
don't know. I heard that third hand, but like I said, I've been having consistent conversations with the folks out there from the Corps, from NIMS, trying to figure out how we're going to continue to move through this process. So far, it's still been working. We've
So
been taking,
ports are getting permits without having to go through the new process, even though that's the policy
well,
under
we've
the
been,
memo?
I only know from my end, we don't require permits to be in place before the NEPA is finished. So we've been working that MARAD's been the lead agency to go through the consultation process. And then we leave it up to the Corps as to whether or not they're going to accept what we've done. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So,
I still think it'll be a bit more challenging out in the Pacific Northwest.
oh,
to
and
get
I
anything done.
agree with you. And I've been trying to work to see if we can get this something in place that works for MARAD to get through the process. I can't really help with the Corps, but I have been talking to them as well, and I'm going to continue those conversations to see if we can kind of streamline this process, because I know with all the various grant programs that, you know, there will be more out there in the Pacific Northwest. So,
Absolutely. Thank you.
you know, we're trying to figure out a way to make that process easier.
Great. Let's go next to Alvaro Zayas. Alvaro, you can just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, I'm sorry, it cut off. This is Alvaro Zayas. Did you call on me?
Yes, please go ahead, Alvaro.
Okay, sorry. Thank you. Chris, thank you very much for the presentation. Very informative. I have a question or two questions on two of the points you made. Maybe for a little bit more elaboration on them. One of them is for, let's say, a multi-component project that does have one component regarding rail or roads, and the inability to complete a CADEX through MARAD. And then the other question is regarding the level of Section 7 consultation that's needed for a CADEX.
Okay, so for the first part of your question, yeah, none of our CADEXs cover rail or roads, and that's either rehabilitation or construction. We very rarely can plug that into one of our CADEXs that we have for like reconstruction modernization. But typically the level of effort, the scope of the work that's being done for the improvements to either the rail or the road have historically been so extensive that we don't feel that it fits within our CADEX. I'm not sure if that makes sense. Basically, you know, historically there's been too much work done on the improvements for either rail or road that we can't kind of squeeze it in. Does that part make sense?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
it does. And a follow-up to that, and these CADEX would not be able to be broken down into each component, so an individual CADEX per component of a greater project.
Typically not, but it depends. We have done it in a few situations, but there has to be independent utility and there has to be some sort of phasing to the project that makes it clear cut that they're not tied to one another. The point being, we need to avoid any kind of segmentation issues under NEPA. So typically we wouldn't do more than one NEPA document for a project. But there have been a few instances where we have been able to do that. It just depends.
Okay, understood. So if the better bet is if we have rail included in either the project or any of its components, the CADEX process of the NEPA would be carried out with one of the other agencies that you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, we can do that, but we have in the past at times gone through FRA to use their CADEX. Some of the issues that we've had with that is, you know, FRA under these grant programs will get many more grants than we do. And, you know, they're usually focused on completing theirs. So throwing one back at them, you know, and asking them to do a CADEX, you know, it ends up taking a little bit longer than we would like. You know, understanding their workload and their challenges, you know, I get it, but it still has proven, you know, time consuming, and doing a more streamlined EA has been a much quicker process for that sort of thing. But, you know, we do have those discussions both with FRA and whoever the grantee is when we get to that kind of a question as to what's the best path forward. So, you know, we wouldn't decide that independently. We would have that discussion with the grantee on, you know, how do you think the best path forward is, what works best for you and your project and, you know, your timeline.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think I have a good grasp on that. The other question was, I was wondering what level of Section 7 consultation would need to be carried out through the CADEX with MARAD, and if potentially at the level of a CADEX, if MARAD would be able to assume a consultation that was carried out through, let's say, the Corps of Engineers through the permitting process.
It's gonna all depend on what your project is. The most basic Section 7 review that we would do for a CADEX would be a desktop review. So, you know, assuming that there are no endangered species, that sort of thing, assuming that your project is minimally invasive or has minimal question marks, we might just do that. But, you know, like I keep saying, it depends. Every project is different. So I'd have to know more of the specifics. We'd have to take a look at what might be there before we move forward to, you know, doing a more in-depth consultation and, you know, putting in that higher level of effort. So I know that's probably not the answer you want, but it kind of goes back to me saying, you know, if you have a specific project you're either thinking about or, you know, have already decided, we can have those conversations beforehand, before you get the grant, so you can have some idea of what level of effort you're going to need to do. With the Corps already having done the consultation, I'll tell you, a lot of times our legal office is looking for those consultations to include, you know, that you're looking, that the documentation discusses that you're looking to go for some kind of a grant, and that would be something that would be done before you had the grant, because obviously you wouldn't know for sure if you got it. So some sort of a blanket statement within that consultation that says, hey, we're going for other federal grant funding for this project, then that gives our legal office, a little more breathing room to say that that covers us from our federal obligations on MARAD side. The other thing that we've done is we've gone back to the the resource agencies that the consultation has been completed and said, hey, can you shoot us an email that says we don't need to reconsult on this because the Corps has already done it. All the information is valid for our use. So we've done it that way as well.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that was an interesting recommendation. I think it's a good one at that. Certainly, at least in our experience, going through consultation through the permitting process, and then after the fact, seeking consultation, specifically for the Section 7, some of those agencies that they would prefer not to consult two separate agencies, and
Yeah.
it could muddy the waters moving forward. So I
Yeah.
appreciate the info.
Yeah, like I said, we try and figure out, ways to streamline and get stuff done quicker, but we do still have our legal obligations. So, we walk that fine line of making sure we're fulfilling our obligations under NEPA, but trying to figure out ways that, we can satisfy that without having to jump through extra hoops if possible.
Yeah, I agree. And thank you. Thank you again.
Thanks for the questions, Alvaro. Let's go next to Ram Kancharla.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Hi, Chris and Peter. Thanks a lot. A lot of good information, but we are quite familiar. Let me ask you, turn it around a little bit. So we have all the big consulting firms, like some of the big ports may have. They have done dozens of NEPAs, any one of them. I don't need to name the consulting firms. But the outcome, obviously, the reason we are on this call is different from maybe it could have been smoother, more efficient, etc. Is there something you can do? Maybe they've done it, but they've not been able to be more efficient or whatever, because we did many of the things you're saying, Chris, like hiring a big consulting firm ahead of time, because we maybe had the money to spend some money, even though it's going to be wasted. We have done the visit, we have done the consultation again and again, etc., etc. But obviously we faced some situations that the project is still not have final sign off after 2.5 years. So bear with me for the frustration, but I don't know, maybe you say, these are the 20 consultants we will train, or do not start it, even start before or after, do not start it till you send your consultant to us. Some of this has been done, but even if it's been done, the outcome is the duration, right? We want to do these projects, we want to spend the dollars to build the infrastructure, and now that obviously the business case itself is changing, believe it or not. And I think that may be the case for many people here. What I'm saying is, people like me, I do many different things. I depend on my consultant to be an expert in this matter and do all the things you're saying, so that it is efficient, streamlined, it get it done in a reasonable time manner, etc., etc. I don't know what else to say that other than saying we have done most of the things you're saying, and but yet it seems to drag on. So is there some other suggestion you can come up with? Like I said, we put your consultant in your office for a week, I don't care, whatever it takes, so that any and every issue is fully discussed, so that when they submit, for example, I'll give you an example. I'm rambling, but you said some states have NEPA. In our state, our project, we don't have state NEPA in Florida, but our project had a core permit, NEPA, fish and wildlife permit, National Marine Fisheries permit. Yet you guys said that doesn't matter, you have to do it again. And to the extent that after several months, these same agencies came to us because we have a working relationship like most boards and said, what are you asking for this again? And we had to, of course, they realized we get a federal permit, a federal grant now. So just because we don't have some state NEPA doesn't mean the Army Corps hasn't given us a permit, or National Marine Fisheries, etc., haven't given us a permit. But that was completely ignored. So there are things that can be done. Again, if we can have some, I don't know what to say, really in-depth consultation to say, for example, you're saying road. Let's say you do a rail spur within 30 acres. Is that considered rail, or is it a part of a bigger, if we did 2-3 miles? For example, we did 25 acres of cargo storage yard. Obviously, there's going to be a road which is a quarter of a mile or something of that nature. Is that considered a road really? It's just a road within a cargo storage yard. So anyway, you get the point what I'm trying to say. So we need to clarify these issues so that it helps us and not drag the process.
Yep. And I appreciate your frustration, and I thank you for sharing that. And I'm happy to have, offline discussions with you if you want to talk about, more details related to your frustrations for your particular project. We can totally do that. We are constantly looking at ways to streamline our process, and, again, we still have to meet our NEPA requirements, but we're always trying to figure out ways to get through the process as quickly as possible. So I'm happy to have, future offline discussions with you and anyone else that, wants to share their ideas and, discuss facets of their particular projects and, how the delays impacted them. So that's all I can offer at this point in time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ram. I'm going to go to a question we had in the chat here from Randy Lewis. He's asking, how does NEPA apply to a project where grant funds are being used only for a portion of the improvements? For example, rail construction on a project that includes terminal or other improvements that will not be funded with grant funding. Is MARAD's review limited to the elements that are grant funded?
So in that case, if your application includes the facets of the project that both involve the federal funds and the non-federal match, everything that is included in that application would be included in the NEPA review. Now, if you're also doing other things that don't fall into that application, but don't have independent utility from what is included in the federal project, we would need to take a look at that and make that determination. So basically, if you have if what you're asking for grant funds for is a component of a much larger project, if that component that is being funded by the federal government does not have independent utility from the much larger project, we would likely have to look at that as a whole. But again, it goes back to my favorite 2 words, it depends. So I'd need to know more specifically what all the pieces, parts of the project are to make that determination. And happy to do that with you, offline if you want to have a pre-application call or just general, we're happy to do that with you.
We have a few minutes here remaining in the call if anybody else has a question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, yes, I have a question. I just couldn't figure out how to put my hand up in the Zoom. But for the MARAD grant projects, is an EJ analysis performed, environmental justice analysis performed, and or considerations of potential EJ concerns taken into account prior to awarding the grant? And part two of the question, if are there opportunities after the grant has been awarded for the project to be modified to address concerns of communities of communities with environmental justice concerns, if these concerns are identified after the grant is awarded?
So I think your question is, does the review of the application consider EJ? Is that correct?
Yes, that's the first part of the question. First question.
Okay, so to answer that, for our particular review team, it's a NEPA review team, and NEPA does include EJ. But typically, there won't be that specific information about potential EJ issues. Some applicants may highlight that sort of thing if they're doing, beneficial type activities. But we're looking at it on our particular team as for NEPA as a whole. So we wouldn't necessarily single out EJ. I would defer to Peter if there's any other specifics to EJ for other review teams, because I'm not 100% sure on that.
Yeah, no, and I was just going to add, Chris is absolutely right. And in addition, we do have environmental justice as part, as a merit criteria to review. If a project is selected for award, and based on the results of the review by Chris's team and this other merit criteria review team, it's determined to be deficient from an environmental justice standpoint, then as reflected in section F, as in Foxtrot, of the notice of funding opportunity, there are certain things that we will work with the grantee to address in order to remedy that deficiency. So I would say the answer to your question is yes, both in terms of merit criteria, and then yes, with respect to post-award, to the extent that there are environmental justice issues that are identified by the selection official that need to be addressed prior to grant agreement.
Thank you.
Okay, we've come to the end of our hour here. I want to respect everybody's time and wrap up the call. But first, I want to give another thank you to Peter, to Timothy, to Chris, and to Aaron, and to all the staff. I know Travis Black really helped set up this call, and to all the staff at MARAD who have done some great work this year in getting some of the implementation from the bipartisan infrastructure law rolled out. And I know we're going to see some great projects announced later this year, and we'll have 4 more years of really high levels of funding down the road for these programs. So thank you again, Chris. And just for everybody on the call, we will be distributing a recording of this presentation, a copy of the PowerPoint slides, and look forward to a continued dialogue. So thank you again. And I hope everyone has a good rest of your day.
Thank you.